Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Story of Alice, Lewis Carroll and the Secret History of Wonderland, by Robert Douglas-Fairhurst, narrated by Shaun Grindell. Prologue. Snap. I am not myself. Lewis Carroll, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Hidden away inside a plain cream folder in the Biography library at Yale, there is a black and white photograph with a handwritten caption, Alice P. Hargreaves, 1932. It was taken on the 31st floor of New York's Waldorf Astoria Hotel, in a large suite with views across the city's jagged skyline, and it marked the start of a visit to celebrate the centenary of someone the sitter still referred to with Victorian propriety as Mr. Dodgson. To the rest of the world, he was better known as Lewis Carroll, the author of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, 1865, and Through the Looking-Glass, and What Alice Found There, 1872. Two of the most popular and influential stories in the history of children's literature. But he was not the only person involved in their creation, whose real identity had become bundled up with a literary one in the public mind. For the past 7 decades, Alice P. Hargreaves had also been living a double life. I first came across this photograph in the autumn of 2013, after leaving a gloomy Oxford at the start of October. I had already spent a couple of weeks travelling across America in the search for material that would help me make sense of Lewis Carroll's life. In some ways, it was also an attempt to make sense of my own. Like many people, I first read the Alice books as a young child, and the mixture of feelings they produced in me at the time, an emotional scramble of amusement, fear, bewilderment, and sheer unexamined joy, had never gone away. But it was only now that I found myself wanting to know why. I was approaching middle age, and although there was no sign yet of a full-blown midlife crisis, I was getting used to discovering new sources of niggling anxiety. Would I ever be able to read anything again with the unalloyed passion I had once devoted to books like Alice's Adventures in Wonderland? The brightness of Carroll's dream world also seemed to sharpen certain forms of loss. How had Carroll managed to create something I still remembered so intensely, when the rest of my childhood had faded to a distant blur? Every few days I arrived in a new city, checked into a budget hotel, and then hunkered down in an archive with no company other than a handful of academics tapping away at their laptops like eager woodpeckers. The life of a travelling researcher is not a glamorous one, and so far it had been a predictably depressing experience. Each morning involved the same routine: rubbery breakfast eggs, table for one, sir, a short walk, a polite exchange with a librarian, and then long hours working through scraps of writing that gave the illusion of order as they arrived in their neat cardboard boxes, but stubbornly refused to settle into a meaningful pattern. There had been a few highlights. In New York, I was shown a game Carroll had invented for one of his child friends, and on the other side discovered some doodles that included a fragile stickman and 3 attempts at a bird flapping its wings. In Texas, I was allowed to turn the pages of Carroll's first photograph album, where it was still possible to see pale brown traces of the gum he had used to fix his original albumen prints in place. But it wasn't until I arrived at the Biography library on a crisp sunny morning towards the end of October that I saw pieces of Carroll's biographical jigsaw that allowed many more to slot into place. Inside one box was Alice Hargreaves' passport, and another contained a fat scrapbook of newspaper clippings labelled APH, and an academic hood. And linking everything together were hundreds of references to the little girl who first inspired Carroll to create his most famous literary character, and then spent the next 70 years living in her shadow. Alice Pleasance Hargreaves was the original Alice in Wonderland. Although she had become a minor literary celebrity herself in the years immediately before this photograph was taken, there were occasions when she found the constant thrusting of microphones and flaring of flashbulbs something of an ordeal. She disliked having her photograph taken all her adult life, one of her neighbours later recalled. And although Carroll's photographs of her as a girl are among the most popular of Victorian images, later examples are extremely rare. On her return to England, she wrote to her son Carroll, an interesting choice of name, confessing, "Oh, my dear, I am tired of being Alice in Wonderland. Doesn't it sound ungrateful? And is. Only I do get tired." Sometimes it showed. In other photographs taken on the same day, she appears crumpled and confused. But in this one, she holds her pose with steely determination. Her hands are clasped tightly in her lap. A faint smile plays across her mouth, as if she is amused by the attention, or perhaps bemused by the fuss. Her favourite velvet bow, a variation on the newly fashionable Alice band, is perched at a jaunty angle on her head. Meanwhile, just visible in the background is another Alice, a pert little girl in a crisp pinafore dress, who gazes off into the distance with her arms folded in a mocking echo. It is as if the screen on which she was painted was really a magic mirror in which old people could become young again, the tedious business of adult life transformed into a children's game. It was a game many people wanted to play. In the opening pages of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, Carroll tells us that his heroine was very fond of pretending to be two people. But throughout her visit to America, the newspapers were keen to present the widowed Alice Hargreaves as one person rather than two. Not only had she previously been Alice Liddell, the little girl who had persuaded Lewis Carroll, Mr. Dodgson, to write down his fairy tales, but the real Alice was widely assumed to be identical to the fictional Alice. As a result, the arrival of an old lady in New York soon became a story about Alice exploring a new Wonderland. On Friday, 29 April, a scrum of 30 or 40 reporters surrounded her on the sundeck of the Cunard liner Berengaria. In a short Paramount newsreel entitled Alice in U.S. Land, she reflected on her childhood, speaking in an upper-class drawl that was spiced with hints of quiet mockery. Nothing she said in this crackly recording was very unusual. "It is a great honour and a great pleasure to have come over here, and I think now my adventures overseas will be almost as interesting as my adventures underground were." But the next morning, Alice was splashed across the local newspapers. Yesterday she came into her new Wonderland, cooed the Herald Tribune, still wide-eyed but undaunted. She will be 80 years old on Wednesday, but she appeared many years younger than that, a slender, erect little figure in a black fur coat. Her skin, observed the New York Sun, was as clear as in her childhood, while the New York World Telegram informed its readers that her lively little figure was dressed in a frilled and beflowered frock, a relic of a period known as mid-Victorian, like a child who had been let loose in her grandmother's dressing-up box. The New York American ventured further into fictional territory, reporting that her big blue eyes were as bright as they must have been that afternoon so long ago, and her reception drew from her the comment, "Curiouser and curiouser." Later events were taken as the strongest evidence yet that New York was entertaining the real Alice in Wonderland. A photograph of her in the Evening Post, which showed her gamely cutting a cake covered in dozens of intricate pastry characters, was accompanied by the explanation that she was as pleased as a child when Oscar, maître d'hôtel, presented a large birthday cake to her. A ceremony at Columbia University to award her with an honorary degree was designed, her host declared, to honor the little girl whose magic charm elicited from Carroll, 70 years ago, the story that has brought such delight to humanity. Even photographs of her wearing a mortarboard were reproduced like distorted reflections of the climax to Through the Looking-Glass, in which Queen Alice receives a golden crown. No matter how frail she appeared, everyone was determined that Alice should still be the endlessly curious small child from the stories, like an illustration that had somehow wandered off the page and entered real life. The only note of mild dissent came from Alice herself, in a speech she drafted on Berengaria notepaper, which probably formed part of a tea-time radio broadcast over the WABC Columbia network on 1 May. She apologized for not replying to letters and requests for autographs, and warned that, if the children expect to see a girl like the one in the books, I am afraid they will be disappointed. Such quiet realism was quickly drowned out by the sound of ringing cash registers. Carroll, who had come to New York as a secretary and tour manager, noted in his diary that, "My friends here are much annoyed because I only asked $400 for the broadcast, whereas I should have asked $1,000. And for the rest of their stay, he was careful to give the American public the Alice they wanted, a wide-eyed innocent marveling at another new world, rather than a reluctant celebrity being shepherded through hotel lobbies by her ambitious son." Accordingly, on the same day as her radio broadcast, the New York Times Magazine carried a feature on the Lewis Carroll that Alice recalls. A subtitle revealed who was guiding her pen. Her vivid memories of the inspired author of nonsense tales, told by her son, which tried to convince its readers that, regardless of her actual age, Alice Liddell remained young in Lewis Carroll's eyes. Even when she was past 40, Carroll affirmed, she was still, to Mr. Dodgson, the child of the pure unclouded brow and dreaming eyes of wonder, to whom he had dedicated the Looking-Glass, a second article, Alice in a New Wonderland, published a month later in the New York Herald Tribune, left its readers in even less doubt about Alice's true identity. The same Alice who fell down a rabbit hole 70 years ago and landed in Wonderland has visited America and written this added chapter in her new adventures, trumpeted the headline, followed by an explanatory byline. By Alice Hargreaves, the Alice of Alice in Wonderland, and finally in much smaller font, as told to her son, Captain C.L. Hargreaves. What follows is an attempt at wit that rarely escapes whimsy. Beautifuler and beautifuler, Alice cries as a ship comes into dock. Now the buildings are opening out like the largest telescopes that ever were. Later, travelling in a hotel elevator, she questions whether they would soon reach heaven. And on arriving at the 31st floor, she recalls how, when I was young, I had to grow my neck long in order to get up to these heights. Here Carroll may have been influenced by the New York World Telegram, which noted that on the Berengaria, his mother asked a question about skyscrapers, with the earnestness of a little girl suddenly transported into an unfamiliar realm, and trying to hold fast to reality. Even her experience of being hounded by a pack of photographers was turned into a modern comedy of manners, with an illustration that depicted the fictional Alice being surrounded by camera lenses as a set of huge, unblinking eyes. It isn't hard to explain the contemporary appeal of these articles. A reader who came across Alice in a New Wonderland in the Herald Tribune would only have had to turn to the front page to see why an innocent abroad might have been an attractive figure in Depression-era America. The leading article, Shall the Underworld Rule?, warned in lurid detail of the increasing threat posed by gangsters, described as the spawn of the brothels, the gambling dens and the corrupt political machines of the big cities, under an illustration of the Statue of Liberty, bound by ligatures labelled racketeer, greed, bootlegging, dope and vice. Childhood seemed to be of little advantage in this world. The same article pointed out that Charles Lindbergh and his wife had recently employed 2 underworld characters to aid in the hunt for their baby, who had been kidnapped at the beginning of March and was later found a short distance from the family home, with his skull smashed in like an egg. Even Carroll Hargreaves, whose diary largely reports his New York experiences with sturdy indifference to surprise, seems to have been shocked at the sight of people brawling in the streets over tickets for a late-night screening of the grisly new gangster movie Scarface. The role that children should play in a rotten society was also being investigated in other ways. Runt Page, released in April 1932, was the first of a series of cheaply produced comedies under the general title Baby Burlesques, which showed very young children, many of them still in nappies, acting out comic versions of hard-boiled adult dramas. Even as a 10-minute short, Runt Page is probably 9 minutes too long, although it is still remembered today as the professional debut of a 3-year-old Shirley Temple, who falls asleep and dreams the main action sequence. However, for many people, the survival of childhood innocence was inextricably bound up with the dreams of a much older character. A leader in the Herald Tribune summed up the popular mood. Is it inconceivable that Alice Hargreaves' presence might remind a host of worried Americans of how much more there is in the world than economics? It asked hopefully, and how scant a relationship wealth has to fun. Or, as a fictional newspaper reporter explains to Alice in the 1985 film Dream Child, which depicts her visit to New York as a sequence of real events, muddled up in her mind with far darker fantasies. People want to make believe. Sometimes we have to dream a little. It seems that the real Alice sometimes enjoyed playing the role assigned to her, or at least willingly accepted its demands. A scrap of paper survives in her handwriting that concludes, "Is the fervent wish of Alice in Wonderland," a signature created with the tentative flourish of someone practicing her autograph. Some of her recorded memories went even further. Asked to reflect on her childhood, she was happy to flatten out real life until it fitted the simple and reassuring outlines of a fairy tale. A set of handwritten notes for the article Alice's Recollections of Carrollian Days, as told to her son, Carroll Hargreaves, published later that year in the Cornhill magazine, begins. In the early 60s, in the old grey stone-built deanery at Christchurch, there lived 3 little sisters, Ina, Alice, and Edith. Happy little maidens they. The only missing words are once upon a time. Another draft, which describes some of their Thames excursions with Mr. Dodgson, experiments with "Such is the fairy godfather who helps row," a character sketch that was fluently written in fountain pen before being crossed out in pencil. She was hardly unusual in wanting to view her life as a story. As many writers have pointed out, narrative provides an attractive set of models to follow when we want to make sense of life's uncertainties. The narrator of Julian Barnes' novel Flaubert's Parrot explains why. Books say, she did this because. Life says, she did this. Books are where things are explained to you. Life is where things aren't. I'm not surprised some people prefer books. A story reflects life, but also redeems it. Assembled on the page, even unpredictable events can be plotted, their random scatter made part of a meaningful design. In the case of Alice Hargreaves' childhood river trips, this narrative pull was far too powerful to be satisfied by a light sprinkling of fairy tale language. That was especially true when she tried to remember what had happened on 4 July 1862, the day Carroll and his colleague Robinson Duckworth had rowed her and her 2 sisters up the Thames to a picnic spot near Oxford. Some of the details in her account may be unfamiliar to modern ears. For example, she refers to Alice's adventures underground rather than Alice's adventures in Wonderland, because that is the original title of the story Carroll invented for them that afternoon. But otherwise, her version of events slipped easily into a well-worn narrative groove. Nearly all of Alice's adventures underground was told on an afternoon under the haystack at Godstow. she explained in a later typed draft of the Cornhill article, which has since become famous. Then she added and crossed out a detail about having tea, and finally, afternoon under thee was replaced by a short burst of purple prose in her son's handwriting that ballooned out into the margin. Blazing summer afternoon, with the heat haze shimmering over the meadows, where the party landed to shelter for a while in the shadow cast by thee. Perhaps Carroll was simply prompting her memory. Unfortunately, nowadays my mother's memory is so bad, he warned a correspondent in 1932, and he would have known that, more than 30 years earlier, she had supplied a very similar version of events for the first full biography of Carroll, recalling a summer afternoon when the sun was so burning that we had landed in the meadows down the river, deserting the boat to take refuge in the only bit of shade to be found, which was under a new-made hayrick. Perhaps he wanted to ensure that her account did not contradict the poem that had opened Alice's adventures in Wonderland. All in the golden afternoon, beneath such dreamy weather. Or perhaps he hoped that his choice of language, slightly archaic, slightly arch, would blend seamlessly with Carroll's 1887 essay, Alice on the Stage. Many a day had we rowed together on that quiet stream, the three little maidens and I, and many a fairy tale had been extemporized for their benefit, whether it were at times when the narrator was I the vain, and fancies unsought came crowding thick upon him, or at times when the jaded muse was goaded into action and plodded meekly on. Yet none of these many tales got written down. They lived and died, like summer midges, each in its own golden afternoon. From Three Little Maidens, a tangled memory of the Three Little Maids in Gilbert and Sullivan's operetta The Mikado, which Carroll had seen at least 5 times since its opening 2 years earlier, to the summer midges, a mournful echo of the gnats in Keats's poem To Autumn, borne aloft, or sinking as the light wind lives or dies. The whole passage is a hazy mixture of earlier stories and songs, the daydream of a creative writer. It is all rather different to official meteorological records, which record the day's weather as dreary rather than dreamy, cool and rather wet, with total cloud cover and a maximum temperature of 67.9 degrees Fahrenheit. But for Carroll, a storyteller keen to forge a creation myth for his character, fact was much less powerful than fiction. Memory could create a microclimate that was as fixed as a painted sunset, and Alice Hargreaves, it seemed, was content for her recollections to fall into line, either because, as the cultural historian William Brooker has suggested, as she got older, she may actually have begun to rely on the fiction in place of her own memories, or because, working alongside her canny son, she recognized that her status as Carroll's muse would not be strengthened by anyone rocking the boat. Carroll's version of events has usually been accepted without question, as Brooker notes, although a few critics have raised sensible questions about what this account omits. Taking children on river expeditions, the authors of The Alice Companion point out, inevitably involves moments when they have to pee or are stung by insects and nettles. Most simply repeat the same details, replacing the shifting moods of real life with an afternoon of permanent sunshine. Nor is this a recent phenomenon. As early as 1932, the golden afternoon was being interpreted as a fitting emblem for a lost golden age. The scrapbook of newspaper clippings put together by Alice and Carroll Hargreaves after their trip to New York includes a romantic piece by the journalist Kitty Cheetham, which begins by returning to a very special Wonder Day in 1862, as the young Oxford Don are rowing peaks here and there for a cool, shady spot. She continues breathlessly. The sweet midsummer things are whispering. The threads in the weave are being collected through the spinning of a fairy tale, and then, presumably, remembering the significance of 4 July for her own readers, she points out that on this summer afternoon, 70 years ago, the immortal camaraderie of Carroll's story demonstrated the power of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Exactly how it did this is not explained, but her underlying assumptions are clear enough. Just as the story of Alice's adventures in Wonderland had become a modern myth, so the character of Alice had been adopted as a symbol that brought America's present neatly in line with its past. She was a model of constancy in a rapidly changing world. What this ignores is how slippery and protean Alice's fictional identity had become by the time her living original arrived in New York. When the caterpillar in Wonderland asks Alice, "Who are you?" he receives the uncertain reply, I hardly know, sir, just at present. At least, I know who I was when I got up this morning, but I think I must have been changed several times since then." Her confusion is understandable. Over the course of her adventures, she is variously mistaken for a housemaid, a serpent, a volcano, a flower, and a monster. It also accurately reflects the changing shape of her stories. Having begun its life as an improvised oral performance in 1862, the first written version of Alice's Adventures Underground was presented to Alice Liddell in 1864 as a manuscript that was quirkily illustrated by Carroll himself, the word underground having been tunneled into to become underground. It was then expanded and published the following year as Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, with its sequel Through the Looking-Glass appearing in 1872, both with illustrations by John Tenniel. But if those were the only complete stories featuring Alice written by Carroll, she would continue to enjoy further adventures of her own, as he repeatedly returned to this character and placed her in slightly different contexts, as if wanting to reassure himself that although her surroundings might have changed, she had remained essentially the same. Over the next 20 years, he would publish a facsimile edition of his manuscript, combine both stories for the stage play Alice in Wonderland, rewrite the first book for young children as the nursery Alice, and even arrange for his most popular characters to appear on merchandise, such as stamp cases and biscuit tins. Carroll also had to confront the fact that the question, "Who are you?" was one that many other people were keen to answer. W. H. Auden once pointed out that we enjoy imagining new adventures for popular fictional characters like Sherlock Holmes because they do not seem altogether bound to their original stories. They are bigger than their plots, literary escapologists capable of wriggling free from the covers of any book in which we try to contain them. Carroll's Alice is another member of this select group. While Tenniel's illustrations continued to fix her as a young girl with a neat frock and long blonde hair, she could be incorporated into later satires as a Victorian visitor sent to investigate the modern world, like an anthropologist who lives alongside a foreign tribe in order to study its unfamiliar customs. But her ability to survive outside her original stories also lay in her ability to adapt to changes in her environment. Having begun life as Carroll's dream child, Alice quickly came to populate the daydreams, fantasies, and nightmares of many later writers and artists. From the Golden Afternoon in 1862 to the death of Alice Hargreaves in 1934 and beyond, her fictional adventures never stopped being works in progress. Soon she had been depicted in dozens of sequels and supplements, from serious fictions to slapstick cartoons, in ways that included Alice the Suffragette, Alice the Wartime Codebreaker, and Alice the Enthusiastic Shopper. Rival images to Tenniel's included Villi Pagani's monochrome drawings for his 1929 edition, featuring Alice with a plaid skirt and pageboy haircut. In the year following Alice Hargreaves' visit to America, Pagani's Bobby Soxer would be joined by D.R. Sexton's pouting teenage Alice, who seemed to have wandered into a children's story by mistake. And the even more...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?